President Donald Trump has hit the ground running, making it clear within days that tariffs will feature as a big theme during his administration's tenure. Trump has professed admiration for U.S.'s 25th president, William McKinley, who, as per him, made U.S. very rich through tariffs and through talent, and not just wielding it as a stick. Trump, during his address to the gathering at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos, made it clear that he was willing to dangle it as a carrot as well. Trump promised lower taxes for companies manufacturing in U.S. The big question we're asking now is, what does all this mean for Asia and India in particular? We're joined by Chief Economist for the APAC region at Moody's Analytics, Steven Cochrane. Steve, thank you very much for joining us. Clearly, there are going to be tariffs by Donald Trump, and he is likely to impose tariffs against India as well. He will deliver on that threat. That is the wider expectation. But how do you expect India to be impacted?
Well, first of all, I have to say there's nothing certain about any of the tariffs. It's hard to know exactly what's happening. During Trump's inaugural speech, he directed his advisors, as we had expected, to be looking at trade patterns and to be finding where the biggest trade imbalances were that could be corrected by tariffs. And yet the moves he's taken so far have been not related to a trade balance at all, but related more to the flow of drugs or the flow of immigrants, Canada, Mexico, more recently this weekend, Colombia. So we haven't really seen any indication of what the longer-term strategy is going to be for tariffs. But having said that, I think it's easy to take a look at least one indicator, and that is which countries have a very large trade surplus with the U.S. That those might be targets for tariffs in an effort to try to rebalance trade country by country in a very kind of a transactional way. From this point of view, India, the risks to India are not quite so great. In 2023, India did have a trade surplus with the U.S. of about $43 billion. But compare that with China, which had the largest trade surplus of any country with the U.S. It was about $280 billion trade surplus that China had with the U.S. So about 6 times what India has. From that point of view, then, one would expect that the trade tariff, the Trump tariff policies would be more aggressive towards countries like China or Vietnam or even the European Union, again, Mexico, Canada,
Right,
which are much larger trading partners.
Right. Stephen, we'd also like to ask you about energy imports from the United States. With growing U.S. sanctions on Russia, there is a large likelihood that India will reduce the import of Russian crude. For over 2 years, we've been importing Russian crude at big discounts, and this has helped the Indian economy. But now, if we stop that and start buying U.S. crude, do you expect this to significantly increase India's import bill? Is this a story that you are tracking very closely? Is this a trend that you're watching out for?
Well, I have been watching it because I think, again, if the loss of access to that inexpensive Russian crude does mean that there's a bit of a risk for recession, inflation rising again in India. Most of the energy that is used in India is imported. All the crude oil is imported into India, and so whether it comes from the U.S. or it comes from someplace else, it's bound to be a higher cost. Now, if India does import oil from the U.S., well, that does have an effect in terms of at least perhaps reducing the trade surplus that India has with the U.S. It might actually be a point in its favor if that becomes a bargaining chip for tariffs. But clearly, this would be one factor that would begin to raise inflation again, be something that the central bank would have to watch very carefully in its own policy as it tries to manage inflation.
Right. Donald Trump spoke about how he's going to demand the Fed to take certain decisions, how the rate cycle around the world should follow what Donald Trump says. So what kind of impact do you think this will have on central bank policies across the world?
To be honest, I don't think it has much of an impact on central bank policy. Central banks around the world, they really have a couple of things that they are watching very carefully. One, of course, is managing their own rate of inflation. And this is an issue in India where inflation it has come into the RBI's target range, but it's on the high end of the target range. So it has to be very, very cautious as well. Also, central banks are going to be watching very carefully foreign exchange values that central banks don't want to have a widening gap between interest rates in the U.S. and interest rates in the domestic economy, because if interest rates in the U.S. are much higher, then that would put some weight on foreign exchange. So really, those are the two issues that central banks will be concerned with, and I don't think they'll be taking clues directly from what President Trump has to say. It's really more the economic indicators that they will be watching.
Right. Now, in terms of supply chains, as a result of U.S. policies towards China, now because they have, China has the highest trade surplus with the United States, and the brunt of tariff actions from Donald Trump will be borne by China, how do you expect that to impact India's supply chains?
Well, you can look at this in one of two ways. One is the fact that India is not right now much of a platform for Chinese manufacturing, as opposed to, say, Indonesia, or pardon me, Vietnam or Mexico. That doesn't put India in the crosshairs in terms of being a target for tariffs. But it does mean that, well, there is actually some potential for India to become a manufacturing platform and for intermediate manufacturing of goods as Chinese companies look for locations outside of China. You can see it already in Vietnam over the last 3 or 4 years that Chinese companies have invested heavily in Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. And those are countries that could possibly become targets for tariffs, at least tariffs that are targeted particularly at industries where Chinese firms have located manufacturing plants in those countries. So India will have to, in a sense, be very cautious, but it does provide some opportunity for China to become a location for some of the supply chains of goods coming out of China and then thus heading on to the U.S. and European markets.
All right. Thank you very much, Steven Cochrane, for joining us with that view. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. More news and updates right here.